Hello, everybody. Welcome to Free Kiwis. I'm very happy today to have with me Freddie Attenborough, who works for the Committee for Academic Freedom. Welcome to the podcast, Freddie. Can maybe you just start out by explaining what the Committee for Academic Freedom is?
Yeah, thank you. It's really great to be here. So, the Committee for Academic Freedom was established in 2023, and we're essentially a non-partisan, impartial campaign group, and we fight for the free speech rights and the academic freedom rights of academics in the UK, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, and Scotland, and we are always busy with casework and sort of interventions to the regulator in England and so on. So yeah, that's what we do.
Okay, so one of the questions I always ask academics when they come on to Free Kiwis, academics who are in the free speech space, is how did you get into this mess? In other words, what was your journey from conventional academia, presumably just minding your own business and whatever your field was, into
Yeah,
basically what you're doing now is full-time academic freedom slash free speech work.
yeah, it is full time. Yeah. How did I get into this mess? Yeah. Um, I mean, it's a long story, and I'll try and cut it short. But I was an academic for I think 13 years post PhD, lecturer, then senior lecturer. And in the UK, I guess maybe I started sort of full-time academic work as a lecturer, maybe 2008, 2009. And I kind of feel like I caught the tail end of a time when there was much more emphasis on research-led teaching. Academics would be, the Senate, academic Senate would be a major part of a higher education institution. And slowly over the sort of 2010s, that was kind of whittled away a bit. Market forces became more pronounced. It became a pressure on you as a lecturer to get bums on seats. Recruitment and admissions seemed to sort of hold the whip hand. There was more teaching hours, and there was more restrictions on what could be taught and the way it could be taught, and the type of topics you would have to address. Um, to the point where it kind of didn't feel very much like an academic environment anymore. So about 2021, 2022, I knew Toby Young in the UK. He was now Lord Young of Acton, and he had just set up the Free Speech Union, a sort of campaign group that campaigns for free speech, defends people in court when they've been had their free speech curtailed or lost their livelihood and
Yeah,
so on. And
we actually had Toby Young on a previous Free Kiwis episode a while back now.
right,
Yeah. So hopefully
fantastic.
listeners will be familiar with that. But yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
fantastic organisation.
And we
Rushed
have
off their
our
feet.
own equivalent in New Zealand, actually.
Of course, yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. The Free Speech Union, New Zealand. So I worked with Toby. I worked under Toby for 4 years, and last October, an opportunity came up to join the Committee for Academic Freedom, and it felt like a natural jump for me back into sort of higher education, and academic freedom and free speech issues. So yeah, that's the potted history of the mess, in summary.
Yeah, it's funny. I was nodding when you were talking there because we have a lot of the same issues in New Zealand, especially this bums on seats model. And I mean, I used to work for the New Zealand Initiative, which is kind of like a center-right pro-market think tank. So it's not like I dislike all competition, but I think when it comes to universities, it has some effects which were maybe unforeseen. People didn't realize quite how seriously that would affect the academic environment, I think.
Yeah,
And you definitely get some cases where, a student will complain about something an academic has said, and the university bosses will almost immediately take the side of the student because they're thinking, oh, these are our customers.
yeah,
We're
yeah,
going to scare our customers away. Even though I would argue that often the people who complain are really kind of maybe one in a million is too much, but like you teach like hundreds of students a year and maybe you get one complaint, and then the higher ups will say, oh, you're scaring away the students. And it's like, that was just one student complaint.
yeah,
But anyway,
yeah.
so similar issues. So another similarity, I think, is that both in the UK and in New Zealand, there has been new academic freedom legislation that's been put onto the books. And so that is sort of involved, I think, with this case that's going on now, right?
Mhm.
Even though this case, I think, started before the new academic legislation in the UK went through. But
Yeah,
so it's the University of Sussex versus the Office for Students, I think, which is a
that's
regulator.
right.
And I actually
Yeah,
talked about this with Abhishek Saha on a previous episode. So people who haven't seen that, you want to be really diligent, you can go back and watch that. But maybe you could just go from the beginning. What is this case about? Why is it so important for academic freedom?
Yeah, I mean this story is a convoluted story in the sense that there's sort of multiple strands that all come together. So to start with the court case, of the Office for Students, OFS, is the regulator for English universities, specifically English universities. Um, and the University of Sussex, I mean, this goes back years now. As you say, it was a previous legal regime. They they had a policy, a trans inclusion policy at the time, which came to the OFS's attention. I think primarily because of there was a sort of cancellation campaign against one of their University of Sussex's academics, Professor Kathleen Stock, which is kind of big news. I'm not sure whether it was big news in New Zealand, but it was a disgraceful episode really, where she
Yeah,
was essentially
Kathleen
hounded.
Stock is someone else that we had on Free Kiwis
Right.
podcast, and it is interesting when we look at the listener figures for Free Kiwis that the so-called turfs get a lot of people. So there's lots of interest in New Zealand
Yeah.
about these figures. I mean, I understand because I agree with you. It's pretty disgraceful how they've been treated. But yeah, so Kathleen
Yeah.
Stock, hopefully listeners will know as well.
Yeah, so she was sort of hounded by, the whole kind of masked activists attending, being on campus, shouting and placards and demanding that she be sacked. Why should she be sacked? Because, she had an articulate philosophical view on the importance of women's single-sex spaces. She had criticisms of gender self-ID. These are all things that fall well within the remit, not just of academic freedom, but of public debate. Really important issues. She eventually handed her resignation in. Just a really scandalous episode. But I think from there, the OFS launched this investigation. They couldn't investigate on behalf of an individual. So one of the things that caught their attention was this trans inclusion policy, which Sussex had. It was, across campus, a code, if you like, a code of practice, code of behaviour. Um, and it had some sort of extraordinary formulations in it about that you had to, all teaching must, represent trans people positively. And phrases like that, clear infringement of academic freedom, really. And the OFS found that that was indeed the case. I mean, there were various other things bound up in the OFS investigation, but it ultimately led to a fine for Sussex of 600, well, just under £600,000, sort of record fine that the regulator had levied. Sussex and this it was a long drawn out investigation, and this actually only dropped sort of very recently. Actually, the fine was levied and the decision was announced. University of Sussex, it's fair to say, were not happy at all. And they launched a judicial review, sort of citing almost every kind of public law rationale for a judicial review of the decision to fine them. And so that's been the case that's been underway. And as recently, the decision was the High Court ruling was handed down. The court found on most points for the University of Sussex, and I'm sure we can go on and talk about that in a bit. I'm conscious I could talk about this for sort of 2 or 3 hours, but anyway, that's the court case. And the difficulty in explaining it is because the actual investigation and the court case began under a different legal regime. In the UK, we now have a new higher education law which is in place and has been commenced since August the 1st, 2024. So we're in a different regime. The interesting thing is that the High Court ruling, for various reasons, does have implications for this new regime in the way that we conceptualize free speech within the law, and what that will mean for the OFS going forward. So it's kind of backwards facing in terms of what happened with the
Okay,
investigation
so a
for Sussex,
possible
but it
kind
has
of
these implications.
one sentence summary of this finding is that the Office for Students got slapped down for finding the University of Sussex. Is that what happened?
Yes,
Yeah.
essentially, yes, and it,
And
it,
so that
it
has
got slapped.
implications going forward because basically the academic freedom legislation empowers the Office for Students to regulate the universities even more than it has done before, much more than it has done before around this issue of academic freedom, so that this finding coming just while this new law is sort of coming into effect looks like it's
Yeah.
going to severely weaken the main regulator that's been sort of set up by this new legislation.
Yeah, that's a fair summary. I mean, I think there were public law grounds for questioning the way the OFS went about the investigation and the way it understood things like governing documents, and there's various technical things that maybe you can let them pass. But yes, you're right. It has forward facing. It has implications for the OFS, not least because under the new regime, for the first time really in the UK, and certainly for English universities, we have an enforcement mechanism. So where free speech or academic freedom statutory duties are breached, that the enforcement mechanism that is now coming in later this year is an OFS complaint scheme. And that's where academics, not students, unfortunately, but academics can complain to the regulator, complain to the complaint scheme. And the complaint scheme, as things currently stand, has enforcement powers in the sense that it can investigate, it can request changes to the way that universities have done things, and it can even levy fines on universities for serious breaches. That in the UK, that is, as far as I'm aware, that's pretty unprecedented. We've had sort of education statute before, which has been about academic freedom, but there's never been any real enforcement or regulatory powers, that had teeth to hold universities account. We now
Right,
have
although
that.
it's also fair to say, I think that the enforcement powers aren't quite what people who agitated for this law wanted, right? Because I think initially there was going to be this so-called statutory tort, which
Yep.
as I understand it, tort is a law against sort of civil damages, about civil
Yeah.
damages. And it's usually set by precedent, but in this case, they wanted to actually introduce it by statute and say that
Yep.
if your free speech is violated on university campuses, then you can actually go to a court. That's no longer in the law because the Labour government came in and they were a bit more skeptical of this. And they didn't get rid of it entirely because there was a big uprising among free speech minded academics, but they did water it down to that extent, right? And maybe in some other extent, some other points as well.
Yep. That's exactly right. Yeah. So the law, the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, as drafted, or frankly, actually as passed, had no, sorry, not as passed, as originally written, had two enforcement mechanisms. You're right, had the statutory tort, so academics could take their university to the county court, but it also had this complaint scheme, which was a the first port of call, if you like, when you've exhausted all of the routes via your university, rather than going straight to the county court, which is costly and lengthy and nightmarish process anyway. There was to be this complaint scheme, which was going to be quick, free at the point of use, and it would build up its own set of precedents and
Yeah.
hopefully guide universities in that way. When the Labour government came into power in July 2024, they paused commencement for various reasons. And then when it sort of came back on track, they announced that the statutory tort was not going to be commenced, and they also delayed the complaint scheme. I mean, the complaint scheme has now been delayed for, well, the act was passed in July 2024, and we're only going to be getting it, I think, 1st of September 2026.
Oh, right.
So
Okay.
it's more than a 2-year delay on the
So that
complaint
hasn't
scheme.
even arrived yet. Okay, but crucially, the complaint scheme allows complaints to an external body, right? So if you're a student, maybe I think it doesn't apply to students, right? It just applies to
It
academic
doesn't
staff. So if you're
doesn't apply
a
to
member of
students.
academic staff at a UK English university, sorry, and
Yeah,
you say something about sex being binary, and you get and students mob you, and you're not allowed to speak
yeah,
or whatever, then you can go to the Office for Students, right? And you can
yeah.
say,
That's right.
I'm lodging an official complaint. My rights have been violated, and they're the ones who then reach a finding. Do they investigate?
They investigate. They can reach a finding. That finding might be kind of a remedy of some kind in terms of what the university had done. And it can also, in really severe cases, it can also be a financial penalty levied on the university as well.
Yeah, I think that's actually super important that you can complain to a body outside the university because we tried
For
to get
sure.
that in the New Zealand academic freedom legislation, and sort of
Right.
people within the current New Zealand government told us, "Oh, that's too much red tape. It's too much regulation. What you should have is just," and this is what happened in the end, is the complaint scheme is entirely internal, which to me I think really
Right.
underestimates how bad the environment is among university bosses for free speech, or in the
Yeah.
universities for
Yeah.
academic freedom because of university bosses. And when I did my big report on academic freedom in New Zealand, I found case after case where really the decisive decision about, deplatforming a speaker was taken by the university bosses. So I
Right.
think that going forward, we're probably going to have these cases where academics' free speech is violated, and then they maybe decide to complain, but they're actually complaining to their boss or
Yeah.
people who are closely associated with their bosses, because New Zealand's a small country, small universities, and everybody who serves as an associate dean, they kind of all know one another. So I think it's very
Right.
unlikely that they're going to get objective justice from inside the university. You think, is that too paranoid or?
No, I don't think you're too paranoid at all. And frankly, I think that's probably what the university sector itself, senior administrators and vice chancellors would quite like um, in England as well, is to be able to mark their own homework. I mean, I think one of the problems, and you definitely not paranoid, if to sort of come back to the English context for a moment, one of the things that we find at the Committee for Academic Freedom at the Free Speech Union as well is every time you look at a university's internal policy on things like harassment, discrimination, transphobia definitions, they overreach. Equality law is, of course, equality law, and there are duties that universities have. But the definitions, the policies they have, they tend to, leave out particular limbs of statute, which are really important, or expand the definition beyond which the law would say that you could do, and that's what universities train their staff in. This is harassment. This is what transphobia is. Inevitably, that creates sort of over-reporting of potential hate speech. And of course, if the managers and the senior administrators who are running a complaint scheme have those definitions to hand, and that's what they're working with,
Yeah,
what hope do you have if you actually say, look, my as a gender critical feminist, my speech rights have been breached by this definition which has been applied, and therefore I can't lecture, I can't have this external speaker I want to invite. But they're looking at those definitions. That's the thing, the external regulators will look at statute. They will have counsel that know the law and are impartial and can evaluate whether there has been a breach or not.
yeah,
Once you're marking your own homework, and for years you've been overextending
yeah,
equality law and thinking it applies in a way it doesn't, I mean, that's a recipe for
yeah.
disaster.
And I do think people underestimate quite how skewed universities are politically. I mean, one of the things that happened in New Zealand is that when the new centre-right coalition came into power, well, in their manifesto, one of the parties' manifesto, there was we were going to require universities to have academic freedom policies. And so even before that government came in, and in the early year, in the early sort of in the first year of that government, universities started to put out their own free speech statements to say, look, we're going to comply. We're really good. We believe in free speech. And I think without any real exception, I mean, some were better than others, but they all put out these statements which basically said, we really believe in free speech. You can say whatever you want at our university, except if there's anything demeaning towards the Treaty of Waitangi. You have to have this interpretation of the Treaty of Waitangi. You can't say anything about these groups, you know. And
Yeah,
they sort of
yeah,
presented that as just, well, that's obvious. And of
yeah,
course, if you look at some of the surveys that I and others were involved in, the things that people are really worried about at New Zealand universities are basically the Treaty of Waitangi. They want to be able to talk about Treaty of Waitangi colonialism. They feel like they can't, and sex and gender. And those were often
right.
the things that were sort of carved out. They were named as sort of exceptions in these free speech policies.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so
And I
now
mean, I
it's
guess,
interesting that the way that the new legislation in New Zealand works now that they actually introduced, it requires universities to have free speech policies, and then there's a list of things which they have to have in them. So it basically says you have to do it
right.
properly. And it says that you have to have a policy on deplatforming, that you can't do that, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, so universities have to have a pretty tight freedom of speech code here as well. But just coming back to, I think that probably the closest parallel in the UK is the fondness that universities, or at least people that work in or employed by universities, have for land acknowledgement policies. That's a kind of an import that we've had here. In that, if you, I mean, CAF had a case recently where there was a conference that was going to be hosted at a university, but the leading conference in Middle East studies. But they wanted all participants as a mandatory to have to sort of do a land acknowledgement. Say, if your university is in Israel, you have to sort of have this sort of groveling land acknowledgement. Say this land is stolen, and unless you were prepared to do that, you wouldn't be able to attend the conference. We fought back.
Stolen from the Arabs.
Sorry, say again.
So the idea was that Israel stole the land from the Arabs, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But then the
My,
Arabs
my
stole it from
university
other
had
people,
stolen
didn't
land.
they?
Well, I mean, how far do you go back, and at what point do you regard land as theft? I mean, you
Well,
know,
hold on. Are you
you,
saying this has become a thing in English universities as well?
it has, but certainly that's the one that we had. I mean, that was about 5 or 6 months ago. But I mean, on a positive note, we wrote to the university and we cited the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, and the provisions not for this to happen. Nobody should be having to subscribe to a particular
Yeah.
ideological or political viewpoint that they don't believe. And the university, sort of put pressure on the conference holders and said, look, you can't, if you want to do this, fine, but you can't do it on our campus because it's a breach of our statutory duties. So there are some positives that we
Yeah.
as an organisation have been able to quote the new legislation and actually win
Yeah.
some victories on issues
Can I
like that.
just, I can't help but get caught up on the sort of intellectual point, I guess, because I'm a historian, but well, if it's an English, I understand if there's a conference in Israel, okay, then you can talk about that particular history. But if you're at if you're presenting or doing a conference at the University of Sheffield, like who are you saying the land was stolen by the Anglo-Saxons or something? Like what land acknowledgement do you do?
The land acknowledgement we saw was for if your university was in New Zealand, Canada, United States of America, or Israel, were the four countries that were cited, then you would have to give your sort of statement that your university was on occupied land or stolen land. And I think they even
Oh, I
gave a
see. So if
template
you're a
that you could
I
use.
say I didn't misunderstood. So you're a lecturer, you're an academic coming from abroad to a conference at an English university.
That's right. Yeah,
Okay.
like
So if
global
you're an English
conferences.
academic, you don't have to say this land was stolen by from the Welsh-speaking peoples who were here before or whatever, right?
No, because the policy was very limited
Okay. Yeah, that makes a bit
for
more sense.
decolonial for reasons based on the fact that it was the foundational philosophy of the land acknowledgement in that case was critical race theory and settler colonial
Yeah.
theory, rather
But
than John Locke, which would
yeah.
create a slightly different land acknowledgement policy.
Yeah, that's right, because then you're looking at sort of who's created value on that land, and then you
Yeah,
might end up saying something before you talk like, I'm grateful to all the English speaking people who made this university and built it up over the years. But that
yeah,
probably wouldn't go down very well. But I mean, I guess that's the key point, isn't it? That, if I'm doing a talk, I want to be able to say what I want to say at the beginning of it. And I actually don't care. I mean, maybe I'll be a bit annoyed and think it's stupid, but if an academic colleague wants to do a land acknowledgement that I think is dumb, I mean, I'm happy for them to do so. I'm not going to block that.
yeah.
But equally, they shouldn't be able to compel me to say something I don't believe.
Yeah. It's the compelled. I mean, it's actually the compelled speech element of it, which is then fed through into the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which allows you to push back. But I think on that, I mean, I think what's happened with a lot of sort of senior administrators and managers and EDI officers and this whole sort of swathe of sort of management, which has planted itself in universities over the last sort of 20 years. I don't think they get the idea that all of these things are theoretically based, and if they're theoretically based, they come from political perspectives or ideological perspectives. But what they do, it seems to me, is they think, well, this sounds good, this sounds progressive, this sounds like the sort of thing that we could get on board with, and then they sort of black box it and say, right, so there's something from critical race theory here, there's something from gender ideology here. These things sound good, they're things that our KPIs as senior administrators, we say we've done something progressive. So let's not question it. And we don't have to think about it as a theory, something that academics might like to contest or debate or push back on. It's now a little black box in our policy, and that's what everybody's got to do. So they're always depoliticizing these things in a way that then allows them not to see the issues of compelled speech,
Yeah.
breaches of free speech and academic freedom that
I
result.
I mean, this is why I think the fundamental problem here is just the massive political skew. Because in a way, I almost forgive them for sort of thinking these things aren't political because there's no real political contestation on campus, right? Because they've basically
Sure, yeah,
purged all the
yeah.
conservatives, or like there's so few conservatives through. I mean, selection effects is a very generous way of putting it. So I guess then the idea is to go back to the Office for Students. The idea is civil society as a whole, British society, has to come in via the government or New Zealand society and say, no, you're actually not going to be able to violate people's rights in this way. And so in the UK legislation, in English legislation, it's crucial that the Office for Students can actually do so. It's actually UK legislation about England, isn't it? But it's crucial in that
Yeah.
legislation that the Office for Students actually has teeth and is sort of able to do. So do you think that this result, this finding, is going to completely emasculate it, or is it just sort of but a scratch?
I think the latter. I think it's what we're essentially arguing about now is in some ways it's about, do you think that speech that is lawful should be simply permitted because it is lawful, because there is no other statute that would prohibit it, therefore that speech is lawful. That's the kind of position somebody like myself would take. But what the university sector are sort of pushing back on, and University of Sussex really pushed back on in the case, is the idea, well, it might be lawful, but we need to do a sort of a balancing exercise. We need to assess proportionality of whether, despite the fact that that speech is lawful, despite the fact that this speaker that might come on campus is going to say something that is lawful, are there other rights that are engaged, other people's rights that are engaged, that means that we might need to mitigate that speech because it's so harmful potentially to other people. So we need to put special measures in place. And one of the special measures in extreme circumstance might be cancellation. Personally, I don't think if it's lawful speech, it should be allowed. But that's the battle. The OFS complaint scheme will still go ahead. Looks like we've got signals that it will still go ahead this autumn. But it's now a question of the underlying philosophy. When you complain to it, when you bring a potential breach to it, how it will assess that, what the underlying philosophy is going to be. And that, yeah, we're talking about philosophies, but it will matter in terms of the process of the complaint and the potentially the actual outcome of what the OFS determines. Has it been a breach or has it not been a breach?
So are you saying basically that the University of Sussex argument that this should be about balance and there should be all these mitigating factors, that has kind of won the day, and that's going to affect how the Office for Students is able to act going forward?
Um, yes, I mean, unfortunately, we don't yet know whether the OFS is going to appeal the decision. We're sort of a few days away from knowing that. I think there are good reasons for the OFS to appeal. One of them is the thing that we are talking about now, which is what freedom of speech within the law actually means. That was one of the things that was ground in the initial judicial review. I think that needs the OFS to appeal. If they don't appeal, yeah, it probably, yeah. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but
Yeah.
my sense is it will have a material impact on the way the complaint scheme is both run and the type of determinations it makes at the end of a complaint.
So, I mean, I remember reading Ronald Dworkin saying, the famous philosopher of law, saying that rights are trumps. I think he has this famous phrase, rights are trumps. In other words, like if you have the point of enumerating things as rights is precisely so that if someone else comes along and says, oh no, but there's this consideration, the thing that you've named as a right is supposed to win out. Maybe not in 100% of circumstances, but in most circumstances. So in that context, if you think about it that way, it's always a bit weird to me when people are saying, "Oh yes, you have the right to say this," but and then they have all of these things, and they're not. It's not like that's libel or something, because there are circumstances where freedom of speech isn't absolute. But in
Sure.
these cases, it's just sort of like it ultimately comes down to we don't like that speech. I
Yeah.
mean, they put it in
Yeah.
other ways. They say, it's demeaning or whatever, but again, here, like, I mean, Kathleen Stock, the way when she was on Free Kiwis and the way I've seen her conduct herself, it wasn't like she was just sort of mocking or jeering, right? She was putting forward
Yeah.
arguments about
For sure.
it.
Yeah.
So it's a bit funny to me that I thought that this whole idea of rights to Trump's was a very mainstream way of understanding rights and including free speech rights. But now we have this, I think, environment where the legal elite and the academic elite are sort of skeptical of the idea that you should have a right to free speech, which is stronger than things like, I'm afraid to say it, but like feels, right? Like just people don't
Yeah.
like it,
Yeah. Yeah.
therefore we have to balance it.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think of and in practice, whatever a lawyer would say about proportionality exercise, a balancing exercise, and they would say in principle these things happen, and maybe in the court of law it would happen, but in practice, a balancing exercise on a campus too often means, well, somebody wants to say something robust about women's rights here, they're likely to provoke a lot of reaction. There's protesters already saying they're going to try and cancel. We've got students saying they're upset, they're crying, they're traumatized by this gender critical feminist. The balancing exercise there too often becomes, well, people are upset. So what does it matter really if we cancel or mitigate this speech, or only allow them to talk online, or only allow them to do an invitation only event, because there's people's feelings over here. They're traumatized by this speech. So the weight, the kind of the sort of social cultural weight always seems to fall on the idea that because people over here are upset and saying they're traumatized, therefore that right of people to have their free speech and debate these ideas must be secondary. because we've got this hurt feeling sense over here. And in practice on campus, that is what a balancing exercise for the last 10,
Yeah,
15, 20 years has become.
except it doesn't apply to certain people, right? Because if you're like a Christian or a conservative or something, and you say, "Look, I really don't like," in my biology class, people were talking about evolution, and I find that upsetting. People are even saying that God doesn't exist, the Bible's wrong. I find this deeply offensive. And actually, some religious people do have these quite strong convictions. But of course, we routinely kind of override that, and I think for good reason. Like I think, yeah, I respect religious people, but we have to be able to discuss things openly in a
Yeah.
university. But for some reason, the same doesn't go for some other groups.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, and this is the problem when you get away from an objective legal standard. So, we have the Public Order Act over here, and one of the speech offences is causing a harassment, alarm, and distress. That's quite a high test, and it's an objective test within statute. Really, under that, if you have an objective test like that, you take subjective perception of the judging bodies, the judging people, the university administrators out, at least to a massive extent. It's not no longer there. But once you start saying, well, there's harm and there's hateful behaviour and there's triggering behaviour, that's so subjective that you cannot help but, your underlying political allegiances. Are you left-wing progressive? Are you a right-wing conservative? As you say, most universities, they've got the left-wing progressive bias. There's inevitably going to be a bias in the time. You're not going to get a universal application of hate and harm and triggering, behavior on campus, because they're judging it from their with their underlying biases in a way that with a legal definition you don't perhaps get that problem so much.
Yeah, okay. So what happens then if they don't appeal or their appeal fails and this kind of precedent is set? Like what has to happen so that the government can actually get a grip on academic freedom at universities? Do they have to introduce a new law? Do they have to amend the current law?
Um, well, it's frustrating really because the law as written, the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act as written, was really a sort of a breakout moment in some ways. I don't think I'm exaggerating. It was a precedent-setting piece of legislation to have these enforcement mechanisms. We are in danger now of sort of rolling back the clock. We don't. The statutory tort's no longer there. If the OFS complaint scheme is sort of snagged in the post OFS v Sussex court ruling and the implications of that for free speech, you've got a complaint scheme, but actually in practice, what is it going to be able to do? So we're sort of back where we were pre the new statute. So I can't see anything changing under the current government because they seem happy with the approach as it is. But yeah, it might be one of those where we have to go back to the drawing book as and when there's a new government, which is incredibly frustrating. Because I mean, I must say that the time that the Labour government has spent sort of pondering and not doing anything and pausing, and the OFS complaint scheme, 2 years and we haven't had it. CAF has had, so many cases come through our desks of academics having their speech rights infringed, policies that
Yeah,
overreach, the land acknowledgement that we spoke about earlier. These things are still there on campus.
yeah,
But it is an insane sector where you kind of don't really have a body that you can go to and say, look, there's the law, but the law's not being adhered to. What can you do something on my behalf? At the moment, we don't have that. We might have it in September, but at the moment, we haven't got it, which is for
yeah,
such an enormous sector, an important, socially important sector as a
exactly. And
university.
I think people still have too much trust in it. They sort of think it is what maybe it was at some point, which is more objective, more balanced. And it's really not anymore, unfortunately. I mean, people do a lot of good work anyway, but there are certain taboos which you really can't cross, otherwise you're in deep trouble, as I
Yeah, for
think
sure.
maybe both of us and others have found out to our costs.
Yeah.
Anyway, thanks so much for coming on and explaining all that to us. So we'll look forward to reading more of your dispatches. I always see them on LinkedIn, but where are you actually publishing these? Different magazines or?
Yeah, I mean, Committee for Academic Freedom has a Threats to Freedom sort of blog where we put stuff on there. But I mean, I publish in various UK magazines like The Critic, Spectator,
Okay,
Spiked. There's a
excellent.
there's a long list. But yeah,
Yeah.
we've got our own page, our own website as well.
Okay, I'm still going to just advise people to follow this man on LinkedIn. So,
Thank you.
all right, thanks very much.
Pleasure.